Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with the distinguished American historian Nicholas Buccola. He has an intriguing new book out, One Man's Freedom, which is a compare and contrast of Barry Goldwater and Martin Luther King and their struggle over what freedom really means. Barry Goldwater, of course, is a particularly intriguing figure, one of the father figures of the American New Right. And one of the things that Buccola told me, or advised me, is that I should speak to a friend and colleague of his, Laura K. Field, who has a new book coming out. It's out in a couple of weeks, called Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. In a curious kind of way, perhaps it's the second volume of One Man's Freedom. And I'm thrilled that we have Laura K. Field on the show on Nicholas Buccola's advice. Laura, do you think in a way that your new book on Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right, is a kind of second volume of Buccola's book on Barry Goldwater?
That's one way of thinking about it for sure. I mean, it might be sort of the third or fourth volume might be the way to think about it, because Nick's book is situated in the 50s and 60s, and so there's a big gap, and there are other books that we could recommend as sort of the next layers. But my book does sort of follow up on his in some direct ways, and some of the characters that he's writing about, especially Goldwater, figure pretty prominently in my book.
What intrigued you about what you call the furious minds of the right? You noted that intellectually you're on the same wavelength as Buccola, which I'm guessing means that you define yourself as a progressive. What attracted you to doing an intellectual history of the New Right?
Well, I am a liberal or progressive, and but my intellectual formation or my academic background is in political philosophy, and I studied with conservatives mainly when I was doing my work, and sort of got drawn in by their approach to teaching the great books. And so that was quite a long time ago now. I studied in Edmonton, Alberta, and for my undergraduate and graduate degrees, and then moved to Texas for my PhD. But so I studied with these conservatives, and then when Trump won the election in 2016, I couldn't help but notice that some people from similar circles to ones I was familiar with, sort of adjacent academic communities, were some of the first to defend Trump from an intellectual perspective. So I became quite interested in that at that time. That was, of course, 2016, and I've been writing about it since about 2019 for public audiences.
The book's title is intriguing to me, Furious Minds. I think it's an accurate capturing of the minds of the New Right. When one thinks of the left, Laura, there's a history of idealizing fury and anger. One thinks, for example, of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon always being one of the great heroes of the 20th century left. Has the right, or has the left, have progressives lost their fury? Are they given it over to the right? Is there something important about the fury of the right?
So the story I tell in the book is basically a short, 8-year history from 2016 to 2024. And I'm mapping the development of this intellectual movement that has kind of gained ground and built up, coalesced over the course of the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. And I do think that there's a kind of building up of fury that has gone on during that whole period. And the way I write about it by the end, right, the story was I was writing it as this history was happening. And when J.D. Vance was nominated, I was finishing up the book and I was quite shocked by that, quite surprised. But it did seem like this kind of culminating moment where the kind of anger or fury that we're seeing in our political life kind of came to this culminating point in the particular circles that I was looking at. So there was obviously a lot of anger in our politics previously. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that there are all kinds of precursors to the men I discuss in the book, historically, as you mentioned, Goldwater being one of them. I think that what we're seeing now has a kind of particular flavor of anger, and there's a kind of masculinist dimension to it. So I'm a little bit playful in the book about what I call these chthonic forces, these sort of ancient forces. I'm trained as a political theorist and love the ancient world, and a lot of the men I write about are also sort of intellectually have that background where they're writing about the ancient Greeks and Romans. And so I sort of took up the furious minds. Part of it has to do with these ancient figures of the Greek Furies, who were traditionally women, really angry women who represented their sort of righteous fury at the injustices that were were meted out to them as women. And I played with that a little bit in my conclusion, to capture what I saw happening on the right over the course, especially of the summer of 2024.
Laura, I'm talking to you from San Francisco, Northern California. The sun is shining. It's a lovely city. It seems to me a lovely world. America seems to work reasonably well. Certainly no worse than it's ever done historically. What are these people so angry about? Where's the fury?
That's a great question, and I agree with you. It's a disconcerting world to look at. The people I'm writing about, can be very disconcerting because, I'll be writing about their outlook, their view of the world, and then I'll go outside for a walk, and in Washington D.C. that they hate, and it's a wonderful place to live. People are friendly, so it's a great question. The group that I'm writing about, the MAGA intellectuals, they look at the world very differently. It's very radical. They look at the modern world and they see decadence, liberal amorality, and nihilism is how they think of it. And they think that in various ways, our political life has degraded to the point of almost no return. And so one of the big arguments that they made in 2016 was that they recognized that Trump was a dangerous political figure in some respects and maybe not their ideal, but they thought, well, if you elect him, at least you have a chance of basically preserving the American Republic as they understand it, and that takes different forms. Or the alternative is electing Hillary Clinton, and from their perspective, that would have been just a slippery slope to a kind of soft and then not so soft totalitarianism. Excuse me. They think that they are the victims of cultural oppression, essentially. And there's a lot of grievance in these circles. I try to, in the book, give some voice to what I take to be serious in their perspective, and some of the serious things, their serious grievances, and why they take some of this so personally, and why they get so angry. So I mean, it's hard to do justice to some of their fuller arguments quickly, but basically they think that things are really bad in the United States. The immigration crisis, they think is undermining the stability of the country. They think that the leaders of the country have mismanaged it. The government is far too big, and a lot of them talk about. They have different ways of describing this, but basically progressive elites or liberal elites or managerial elites or the liberalocracy, they have a kind of radical conspiratorial sense in which they feel like they are being oppressed by the professional liberal class. So that's a start.
Yeah, that's certainly a start. Sometimes one wonders with some of these people. I know you cover Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance in your work. There was a recent controversy over Thiel, always controversies over Thiel. He made a speech in San Francisco about the Antichrist and Mars and immorality. Is an odd character, as is Vance, and particularly Thiel. I wonder if these people have just been reading too much Lord of the Rings, and whether they're just basically children and who've never, I mean, they may be smart in business terms, but I mean, particularly someone like Thiel, can we intellectually take anything that any of these people say seriously? They're clearly important politically. I mean, even someone like Patrick Deneen, who I know you cover in the book, I've invited him a couple of times on the show. He's never agreed to come on. I wonder whether these people are intellectually serious, or whether they're just people who have spent too much time, as I said, reading Lord of the Rings or going on angry internet chat shows.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. And I think that, I guess one of the things I was trying to get across in the book is that I think it's a mistake to underestimate them and their intellects and even their intellectual seriousness. But I will say that this is a pretty diverse group of people at this point. It's pretty big. And I sort of feature one or two of the main characters in each chapter. So there's probably a dozen or so that I think are worth taking seriously. And Patrick Deneen is certainly one of those people.
So I take your point on Deneen. What is he saying? I mean, anyone can read Aristotle, and get all nostalgic and teary-eyed. But people have been doing that for centuries. What is it that Deneen is saying that is in any way original or thoughtful?
Deneen in particular?
Well, you said that he's the top guy. I mean,
no, I didn't. I don't think he's the top. Just to be clear, I don't think he's the top, but I think he's worth taking seriously.
Intellectual, and I know you're not particularly a supporter of these people, but
no, it's fine. These are good questions. I mean, I think Deneen is worth taking seriously. I guess just as a general matter, I think that we tend to, what's our standard for intellectuals, right? I mean, there's a danger here that we say, well, these guys they might be smart, but they're not real intellectuals. But, they kind of, some of these people really are. They have a very deep well of knowledge, right? And in ways that are fragmented and sort of insular and strange to many of us. And I don't agree with their sort of big takeaways. But I just think one of the main points in my book is to kind of try to guard against that instinct, which I share, to be too dismissive, because I think it's politically dangerous, right? Because there are all kinds of extraordinarily intelligent.
But I'm not
we can get into the specifics.
In that direction. I'm not suggesting that if they're not original, we shouldn't take them seriously. I'm just curious, because a lot has been said and written on Deneen, and as I said, I've invited him a couple of times onto the show. He's probably too busy. What are they saying that hasn't been said before?
You bet. Yeah, I think Deneen, I'll just say I sort of agree with you. I think there's something here where he's not saying something that's super original. He's rehashing this kind of older argument about liberalism and a critique of liberalism that says liberalism is inherently flawed. It's an unstable, sort of doomed to fail political program, but he articulates that really, really well in that Why Liberalism Failed book from 2018. So I think he's doing this. He's sort of rehearsing a very common conservative argument, but he's drawing new facets to it, sort of exploring it in new and vivid ways that I think I think he's wrong about the argument, and he's not fair to liberalism. But it is an effective presentation. The thinker I think is the most important, probably, and the one who I take the most seriously is Adrian Vermeule, who is a Harvard professor, a law professor at Harvard, who I think is actually brilliant. He's a super well-regarded legal scholar and does all kinds of work on the administrative law, has a law, this CV that just goes on. And he's worked with some of the best legal minds in the country and, collaborating on books and articles for a couple decades now. So this guy is genuinely brilliant. And he has written a book that's meant to articulate a form of jurisprudence that will replace constitutional originalism. So the old-fashioned sort of typical conservative way of understanding the Constitution and how it should be interpreted. Adrian Vermeule came in 5 years ago and wrote an article for The Atlantic, and then a short book that just tried to kind of blow a lot of that out of the water of originalism and sort of offer a new way of understanding the Constitution that is much more open to state control. So I think it's deeply authoritarian. And he's doing this from a seat at Harvard. And I don't know that it's taken on in the, it's easy to say, well, now, and there are six, Vermeule is also a recent Catholic convert, and he's quite zealous, and he's also involved in a quite radical movement called Catholic integralism. So it's quite radical, and it's easy to think, well, maybe the 6 Supreme Court justices who are conservatives and Catholics are all now going to follow Vermeule. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that he has already sort of supplanted the originalist understanding among the judges that are actually working in this country, conservative judges. But it is a very worrying philosophy that Vermeule has put forward. So there are all these different cohorts and characters. He's the one I think is the most genuinely brilliant.
Let's get to Vermeule. What is he saying? He's saying that, we talked about Deneen saying that liberalism doesn't work. What is Vermeule saying about American democracy? Is he saying that it's a failed system, that it needs to be replaced by authoritarianism, a strong state, a new emperor?
He is much more careful than that. So he is saying that he's advocating for a singular executive, so for a terrific consolidation of power in the executive branch. And he's saying in his book that he says different things in different books, but he has argued in the past that the original federal structure, the separation of powers and so forth, is basically obsolete. And so now you have, basically the presidential authority is almost total, and that's okay because that's what modern systems require. So it's quite heavy-handed in terms of the executive. And then in the more recent book called Common Good Constitutionalism, he argues that the American constitutional order is not defined by principles of equality and freedom, the pursuit of happiness, or any of the things that you might see in the preamble to the Constitution or the Declaration. He argues that what defines the American political system is what has defined all kinds of classical constitutional systems, and that is the common good. So the Constitution, constitutional order, American politics writ large aims for the common good, and then he goes along and defines that, and he gives a sort of theocratic definition that you can trace the origins up to Thomas Aquinas and Catholic thinkers. And it's like health, justice, and security. I can't remember exactly how he defines the common good, but he kind of defines individual freedom out of that. And he claims that this is the originalist, the true originalist position. And it's a very morally heavy-handed position that authorizes the state to use its own power, right, and the power of the law to promote a sort of moral way of life for everybody. That he does not do it very explicitly, but he basically says it's a way of combining church and state power, or at least a very morally inflected way of thinking about the purpose of government. He reads that into the American tradition.
There's kind of almost a medievalism then to it, which
definitely.
It's hard to know whether this is comic or serious. Someone who's certainly more on the comic side is Curtis Yarvin. There's a recent New Yorker piece, his plot about America, his call for a monarchy. I wonder whether the left and progressives are misunderstanding, Laura. I'm sure you've given some thought to this in your book, whether there's a performative quality to this, rather than looking for the hard intellectual origins and trying to just figure out whether somebody like Adrian Vermeule or Patrick Deneen are really Aristotelian or followers of St. Thomas Aquinas or one kind of intellectual heritage or other, whether someone like Yarvin is a better model for making sense of it in terms of its performative 21st century quality, which obviously is also related to Trump's performative political strengths.
Yes. I think that's one thing that distinguishes what's happening now from what we saw a decade or so ago with the old conservative establishment is this performative dimension.
Sorry, I'm jumping in here, Laura. If you can bend over closer to your mic, because some of your words are getting lost. Go on.
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things we are certainly seeing with this new movement that distinguishes it from the old establishment conservatism is this extraordinary performativity, and that is something that you certainly saw in politics, right? There were all kinds of the shock jock radio hosts and everything, but now I'm writing about largely people with PhDs from pretty prestigious institutions, and they are really getting in on that game. And then they also have sort of these new legions of young men, especially who are influencers, who are imitating, who are drawing their ideas and bringing them even to a broader public. Curtis Yarvin certainly is that, at least in his writing. His writing is more performative than I think he is as an individual when he shows up to things. But the words are so provocative, and the way he writes is so it's got its own stylistic thing that he's doing. And there are others. I have a few chapters in the book where I go through some of these people, some of whom appear on like Tucker Carlson's documentary series that I feature in one of my chapters. Or there's this other figure who's extremely bizarre named Bronze Age Pervert, who is most of his life is a kind of performance on Twitter, with the bodybuilding and all of this. I think the danger there is that we see it as performative and not serious, which is easy to do.
Jumping in here, I apologize if I'm interrupting.
Okay.
I don't see why there should be any contradiction between being performative or serious. The two are the same, really. I mean, my point is that perhaps the left has misunderstood this new right and seen its performative qualities as not serious when that's the thing in itself.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably how I think about it, that there's been a bit of a misunderstanding in that they've been seeing it as merely performative, when really what the new right has done is captured the attention of sort of big swaths of the culture, seen a kind of yearning for a certain kind of performance, and the performance isn't contentless, right? They have things that they're trying to say and get across. Even the most sort of outrageous figures like Curtis Yarvin or Bronze Age Pervert, they are after something. And they've seen how powerful that mode can be, the performative mode. And then, of course, in some of these quarters, it's just drenched in irony. And so it's very difficult to see what's serious and what isn't. But I think the danger the left sometimes makes is to say, well, all that irony is a kind of mask, and there's no real serious there. But some of what is buried underneath all of that is like really disgusting and seriously meant. There's really violent layers to it. There's misogyny and racism, and of course they would make fun of me for drawing attention to that. But I think it's important that we continue to do that.
Yeah, you note that there's a great deal of irony, but when one thinks of these characters, whether it's Vance or Teal or Rufo, they may be ironic in their own odd way, but they're lacking humor. Do you think one of the qualities of the furious minds of the new right is that they're not very funny?
Yeah, some of them are a bit funny.
Are they? I mean, funny, do they mean to be funny, or they're unintentionally
funny and are funny? I mean, I find a lot of it absurd and ridiculous like J.D. Vance, I don't think is funny. Bronze Age Pervert, I do. I mean, I could go through it. I think a lot of them, you're quite right. I think I hadn't thought about this in those terms. I think a lot of it's very humorless, but it could just be that you and I don't share their humor, because of course, if you're going to these conferences or sitting in the audience when they're speaking, they're making jokes. They think they're funny. It's a kind of gross identitarian humor where they're making fun of trans people or pronouns or something, or Barack Obama, and so they're chuckling. I don't. It's not sophisticated. It's not something I find funny. I find it kind of embarrassing for them. But that, so that's. I think in general, though, you're onto something there about the humorlessness of it and the kind of self-seriousness of a lot of these writers and people. There are a few of them who I would say are kind of funny, though.
Well, I'm going to have to check out your friend, the Bronze Age pervert. And no, it's not really.
I mean, it's gross stuff. I have to give him some credit for some of the. There's a passage about Mitt Romney where he compares Mitt Romney to this ancient figure Alcibiades, and it might just be, my weird sense of humor that did find it.
Yeah. So everything you've said so far has been about men, whether it's Deneen or we haven't talked about Rufo. He's an important figure in it.
Yeah.
Vance, Thiel, Vermeulen, Curtis Yarvin. You've implied, and indeed you've written about some of the gendered qualities of this and the distasteful quality. Is this, if we're to make sense of it, Laura, in historical terms, is it a male response to a more feminized or feminist America? What's the gender? I mean, I assume that there are some female furious minds, although they tend to be more male.
Yeah. So, I mean, I say in the book that one of the things that distinguishes this iteration of this kind of conservatism, which, as we said at the beginning, has precursors, is that it's more savvy with its social media and technology. So that kind of gets at the performative dimension. It's more successful, obviously, right there. They've got the presidency and J.D. Vance up there. And the third thing is, I say it's just more directly misogynist. And I wouldn't have said that when I started writing the book. I don't think I would have thought of it that way. But over the course of the 2 years I spent writing it, that just became just an obvious theme to me. Obviously, being a woman, I'm attending to that and trying to think it through. And I tried to think of, okay, well, what women should I include who kind of matched my requirements, which were either that you kind of have a PhD just to kind of filter out some of the influencers and the people who weren't really in this category, or that you played an important role in these intellectual circles over the course of the 8 years I was covering. And so I couldn't think of any women that they respected, that they included in their conferences and stuff that sort of met that requirement of being significant and well regarded within these communities or having this important role. So of course, I've thought quite a bit about why that is. Where are the women? There are certainly women who are part of it. They tend to work in comms. There are plenty of people, in the staffing the new administration who are women and who have gone through some of these conservative programs that I talk about in the book. But none of them sort of rose to that level. So it's a kind of a mystery, but not a mystery, because part of the doctrines that they believe in are sort of medieval in this way, or certainly pointing very much backwards, trying to kind of return women more to the private sphere. And as you say, I do think it's a backlash to, or that's certainly how they would put it, that they are part of an overt backlash against the feminization of society. And in some cases, like Bronze Age pervert, he talks explicitly about this with these elaborate metaphors. He talks about this whole thing called the longhouse, which is basically, I mean, we could get into that, but they've got these conceptual categories. They are thinking about it in terms of a rejection of modern feminized society, and this is a pretty prominent theme across the different platforms of the new right.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to what I was saying before. It's hard to know what to make of this, whether it's just a real life version of Monty Python, or, I mean, it's obviously more serious than that. Not that Monty Python isn't serious. We had a couple of years ago, we had Margaret Atwood on the show, of course, whose Handmaid's Tale predicted all this. I mean, basically, was she right? This trad wife, fetishization of fecundity, violent rejection of femininity and of the idea of love. What has happened? It seemed when Atwood came out with that book, it was a brilliant book. I mean, she's a wonderful writer, but it seems still sort of fantasy. When I talked to her, she said, well, I wrote it about America. And I didn't quite realize how political it was.
I think there's a lot to unpack with this question. And part of this thread in my book, I was constantly surprised by and shocked by. So, I mean, I studied in conservative circles, but they never struck in academia. They didn't strike me as misogynist like this. I'm still constantly surprised by it. I think that a lot of it has to do with strains of thought in American life that have to do with Christianity in some instances. And there's a wonderful book called Jesus and John Wayne. I don't know if you've interviewed her, but Kristen Kobes-Dumez, and she talks about the evangelical world and how patriarchal it is in some pretty extreme ways. And I say in my book that this world of the intellectuals is kind of playing catch up with that. So I think I think we have to. So that is in the book that I think has happened. I think it's a really disturbing part of what's happening in our politics. I also think it's an incredibly big and diverse country that nothing like this has taken over everywhere, obviously. And so, I think we don't want to get caught up in thinking this is the future. I think that what is happening is that a lot of young men are really attracted to some of this. There are also so many young men who aren't, but there's a kind of political culture out there that we should be mindful of and learn about. I don't think we need to be open-minded about the misogyny, but we can recognize that young men are struggling, right, if they're attracted to all of this, and try to think about masculinity in new ways.
Yeah, we've done many shows on the crisis of young men. Richard Reeves, of course, whose work I'm sure you know. You had an interesting piece for Le Monde recently about the tensions within the American right. You noted that these people are not a majority of the Trump coalition, the MAGA coalition. How much tension is there? I mean, is there also a sort of mystification, shall we say, amongst mainstream conservatives with characters like Bronze Age pervert?
Yeah, I think there's a definite mystification, just as you said, with Bronze Age pervert, with Curtis Yarvin, especially with the tech bros. I think there's a kind of mystery mongering or something going on that is unwarranted. And part of what my book is not focused on the Silicon Valley world, but it is trying to demystify the intellectual side of this, because it's, as we've noted, it's couched in irony. There's this Catholic dimension to some parts of it. There's a nationalist, nativist strain. There are all these different strains, but mostly it's a lot of kind of edginess, performativity, and a lot of it's extremely radical, as I've continued to note. Just insofar as it's not really upholding what traditional conservatism, say a decade ago, would have upheld as the basic way of understanding.
Barry Goldwater must be turning in his grave.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's in some ways a continuity with him, but I think he'd be shocked by a lot of this stuff. So I try to shine a light on that. I think that it's important to demystify it, because I think on the one hand there are cleavages within the movement I write about. There are fussy little differences between these people, but they're clearly also happy to cooperate in practice and to help shape the administration and the policy. So I think there's a danger in overstating the cleavages and schisms that are within. There was all that stuff at the beginning of the administration with the Doge versus MAGA, Bannon versus Musk. I think there's also plenty of willingness to cooperate, even as some of those things obviously did cause some problems. Some of the tensions caused some problems. But I think the more important cleavage is between the people I'm writing about and just ordinary voters who maybe have not really understood some of the radical underpinnings, the extremism that is informing the administration, that didn't think Project 2025 was a real thing, didn't understand how different this administration would be from the first one. I think that I don't think that the average American voter has been radicalized or red-pilled the way that a lot of the people that I write about have been. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. It's a source of hope, I think, that 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 even now, even when things are looking quite terrifying, there's still a kind of um, I think a sensibility to the American public,
Do you
and
think,
that
though,
will be outraged by some of this.
do you think, though, for progressives, you've defined yourself as a progressive, one of the things that they can learn from your work and these other histories, intellectual or otherwise, of the MAGA New Right is that the left needs to learn how to be furious again. I brought up Fanon. I'm not suggesting they should become Fanonists. But the left is angry about the use, perhaps, of pronouns or other things that most people wouldn't be too bothered with. In terms of this sort of endless conflict over who is more furious, have the left lost the ability to be furious? Maybe they need to rediscover their own fury, or at least give it a 21st century sheen in the way that people like Yarvin and Bronze Age Pervert have done.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I sort of, at the conclusion of the book, I acknowledge that I'm feeling a lot of fury, right? That by the end of the last election cycle, I was feeling a lot of repulsion and anger at the Democratic Party, and just a lot of anger as I was writing about their anger. So there's a lot of anger.
Where was your anger?
My anger was at the Biden administration, at Biden for running again, mainly. I just thought that was shameful. So, and just the kind of stagnant geriatric situation that we have with the Democratic Party. I'm happy to say I'm a progressive, but I'm more just like a liberal. I'm not a moderate. I don't use that language, but I'm sort of centrist on many issues. But I just felt furious at the Biden administration for letting it come to that, and for being so unprepared, and I think for lying to the American public about his situation, his age. So I guess I really hesitate, though, because I don't think, I really don't like the idea of fighting fire with fire. I think anger is a really dangerous political emotion, and it's something that I think since antiquity and sort of the Western tradition, it's important to try to understand and try to address with kind of an open heart and not anger. And so, and to, with some sort of sense of generosity and a hope for rebuilding and reimagining. So, but I also, part of me wants to throw up a bit in my mouth when I talk that way, because I think that it's really, it's a really dangerous moment. I don't know that anger is the right. I think we have to allow our anger to fuel something more positive, something more ambitious, a way of speaking about liberalism and about meaning that does, if not directly imitate people like Curtis Yarvin and Bronze Age Pervert, that at least can articulate the meaning of liberal democracy in a meaningful way that people will be attracted to. Because I think that our political system is very attractive, is very good, does allow there are plenty of things I would reform, but it could be very good. It has deep roots. It has tremendously noble ideals. And so we need to be able to speak about that in a way that resonates. And sure, I'm all for the mockery. I'm all for all kinds of performativity, but I think we have to be careful with anger.
Is it possible, Laura, that these people are right, and particularly someone like Christopher Rufo in his analysis of the American university, that progressives, liberals have taken over the commanding heights? I mean, they use Leninist, Gramsciite language on this, the commanding heights of the economy. They control the media, they control law, they control the universities. Is there some truth to that, do you think?
Yeah, there's some truth to it. I guess that's another source of my outrage, is just some of the ways in which liberals don't understand the sort of extent of their cultural influence, and sometimes their small-mindedness about even just tolerating disagreement. But so I certainly think I try to do some. I don't Christopher Rufo is not someone I admire. I think he's someone who lies and admits that. However, I think I try to talk a lot about higher education, or it's definitely a sub-theme in my book, because I think that there are sort of problems that develop over generations in any in any sort of political regime, in any bureaucracy, in any institution, and that has happened in higher ed. So it's kind of blinkered that higher ed isn't. Rufo is right that administrators and people in higher education are not very good at articulating what universities are for, what higher education is for, and so
maybe because there isn't a reason.
Well, yeah, maybe that there's no reason for the university.
Well, then maybe it's way too expensive and it's not clear why people go. We've done lots of shows on that too.
Yeah, exactly. There are big problems, right? There are big problems with our systems. And so the people I write about shine a light on that. Sometimes they articulate these problems in a fresh way that liberals would do well to think about. Sometimes it's not very thoughtful, and it's just a kind of jingoism or rah about the American founders that they want to push down everyone's throats. So that's what I'm not on board with. I try to walk a kind of fine line in the book, because I am pretty familiar with academia. I try to articulate some of these problems and how I understand the problems, while also calling the right out for their sort of very narrow way of understanding history.
Well, let's end, Laura, on a message. What would you tell people who are watching, who are young men in particular, who are rather intrigued with Curtis Yarvin or Bronze Age pervert? What's the message to these people?
I would tell them that there's nothing wrong with being intrigued by these figures, but that they shouldn't take them as their sort of pole star for any kind of deep meaning or depth or any sort of real understanding of the great works of the American tradition. I mean, not the American tradition, the tradition of Western civilization, which people like Bronze Age pervert and Curtis Yarvin talk on and on about, and Jordan Peterson, and they're not truthful, good representatives of those traditions. And those traditions I love too, and they're wonderful, but there are a lot of better ways to get access to them. So I say go to a great university, get yourself a degree, even if it's from a liberal elite professor. You will learn much more, and you will gain a much deeper and richer appreciation of those traditions. That's where I would start, and study American history. You don't have to. You can just read all kinds of history books and learn so much. It's without being caught up in these culture war issues.
Well, there you have it. Laura K. Fields, Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. We have to thank Nicholas Buccola for our introduction. Thanks, Nick. Great job, Laura. And thanks for the book. It's out in a few days. An important new book, a study of the making of the MAGA New Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. A real pleasure to talk with you.